1944, Winston Churchill had been at war for nearly 5 years. He had watched France fall, stood alone against Hitler in 1940, survived disasters in Greece and North Africa, and lived through years when Britain carried the fight while the United States was still preparing. In Churchill's mind, that history mattered, experience mattered, seniority mattered, and above all, Britain's role as the original architect of Allied strategy still mattered. Even as American armies now filled Europe, Churchill believed influence did not vanish simply because numbers changed. Churchill was not a ceremonial leader. He involved himself deeply in military affairs, often bypassing formal channels to send personal memoranda, strategic suggestions, and urgent cables directly to commanders. He had done this throughout the war with British generals, and later with Americans as well. He believed this was leadership. He believed persuasion, pressure, and personal authority were tools to be used constantly. When Churchill spoke, he expected to be heard, and more often than not, he expected to be followed. Dwight D. Eisenhower understood this instinct very well. From the moment he became Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower had received a steady stream of advice from London. Some of it was thoughtful, some of it was anxious. Much of it reflected Britain's deep fear of repeating the catastrophes of the First World War or overreaching when resources were thin. Churchill's strategic worldview favored caution, peripheral operations, and tightly controlled advances. Speed, in Churchill's experience, often led to disaster. What Churchill struggled to accept was that the war had entered a new phase. By 1944, the Allied coalition no longer revolved around survival. It revolved around execution. American divisions now outnumbered British ones by a wide margin. American factories were supplying the bulk of Allied material. American casualties were rising rapidly as U.S. forces carried the main weight of ground combat. And with that shift came a quiet but profound change in how decisions would be made. Churchill still believed that guidance from London should shape operations at the front. He assumed Eisenhower, polite, diplomatic, and careful by nature, would continue to accommodate British concerns, as he had earlier in the war. Churchill did not see himself as interfering. He saw himself as steering. And when he spoke, he expected obedience not because of rank on paper, but because of history, prestige, and Britain's long experience in war. Eisenhower did not challenge this assumption openly. He did not argue. He did not push back in public. He listened carefully, absorbed the message, and thanked Churchill for his views. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Eisenhower no longer viewed British caution as guidance. He viewed it as a constraint. And as Allied armies surged across Europe, the gap between what Churchill expected and what Eisenhower intended began to widen. Churchill believed influence still flowed downward from London. Eisenhower understood that influence now flowed from the battlefield itself. And the moment Churchill expected obedience was the moment Eisenhower quietly stopped giving it. The disagreement between Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower was not personal, and it was not sudden. It was structural. It came from two completely different experiences of war, formed decades apart under radically different circumstances. By 1944, those experiences were colliding head-on. Churchill's view of war had been shaped by catastrophe. As a young politician during the First World War, he had lived through the failure of Gallipoli, a campaign driven by bold ideas, inadequate preparation, and disastrous execution. That failure haunted him for the rest of his life. To Churchill, speed without control was danger. He believed wars were won by careful positioning, overwhelming preparation, and avoiding irreversible risk. The memory of British armies bleeding themselves dry on the Western Front made him deeply wary of rapid, headlong advances into the heart of enemy territory. This thinking defined Churchill's strategic preferences throughout World War II. He favored indirect approaches: North Africa, Italy, the Mediterranean, the Balkans. These routes, he believed, limited casualties, protected British imperial interests, and kept pressure on Germany without risking a catastrophic collapse. Even after the landings in Normandy, Churchill feared that pushing too fast across France could expose long supply lines, overstretch Allied logistics, and invite a German counterstroke that would turn success into disaster. Eisenhower's experience could not have been more different. He had never fought in the First World War. His professional life had been shaped not by failure in the trenches, but by studying mobility, coordination, and industrial warfare. Eisenhower believed modern war was decided not by static strength, but by momentum. Once an enemy structure began to crack, hesitation became the greatest risk of all. By the summer of 1944, Eisenhower was watching German forces unravel in real time. Allied air power dominated the skies. German fuel shortages crippled mobility. Communications were fragmented. Units were retreating faster than commanders could reorganize them. Eisenhower did not see a fragile enemy waiting to strike back. He saw an enemy on the edge of collapse. To him, slowing down was not caution. It was waste. Every pause allowed German units to regroup. Every delay cost lives by prolonging the war. Eisenhower believed the safest course was relentless pressure, continuous movement, and denying the enemy time to recover. Victory, in his view, was no longer about avoiding risk. It was about exploiting opportunity. Churchill continued to send messages urging coordination and restraint. He warned of stretched supply lines and political consequences if American forces advanced too far, too fast. Eisenhower listened respectfully, but his decisions increasingly reflected a different priority. He authorized commanders to bypass strong points, exploit breakthroughs, and maintain operational tempo even when it created discomfort among Allied planners. This was not defiance in the traditional sense. Eisenhower never told Churchill no directly. Instead, he allowed events to speak. Armies moved faster. Orders emphasized speed, and the campaign evolved in ways that made Churchill's preferred style increasingly irrelevant. Two visions of warfare now coexisted uneasily within the same alliance. One looked backward, shaped by the scars of earlier wars. The other looked forward, shaped by the realities of modern industrial conflict. And as the front line surged eastward, it became clear which vision was winning. As Allied armies pushed deeper into France, the tone of Churchill's involvement began to change. What had once been strategic counsel increasingly felt, to Eisenhower, like pressure. The British Prime Minister was no longer simply offering cautionary advice. He was attempting to shape the tempo and direction of a campaign he did not command. From London, Churchill sent a steady stream of messages. He warned of supply bottlenecks, exposed flanks, and the danger of advancing faster than ports could support. He argued that the Germans, though retreating, were still capable of sudden counterattacks. Above all, he feared that American momentum could outrun British influence, leaving Britain politically sidelined in the final shaping of post-war Europe. Eisenhower read every message carefully. He understood Churchill's concerns were not irrational. Logistics were strained. Fuel shortages were real. Rail lines were damaged. Yet Eisenhower also knew something Churchill did not see from across the channel: the psychological state of the enemy. German commanders were confused, exhausted, and constantly reacting rather than planning. Their reserves were thin. Their command structure was breaking down. To Eisenhower, this was the decisive moment. Slowing down now would allow Germany to stabilize its defenses and extend the war into 1945 and beyond. Speed, even with logistical strain, offered the chance to keep the enemy permanently off balance. Churchill, however, began to press more insistently. He raised concerns through military channels, political channels, and personal correspondence. He questioned whether American commanders were acting with sufficient coordination. He worried that British forces were being drawn into operations they had not shaped. In private, he expressed frustration that Eisenhower was allowing American initiative to dominate Allied strategy. This was a delicate line. Eisenhower could not afford an open break with Britain's wartime leader. The alliance depended on trust, optics, and unity. Public disagreement would have been disastrous, but Eisenhower also could not allow political pressure to override battlefield realities. So he responded in a way that defined his leadership style. He did not argue publicly. He did not issue sharp replies. Instead, he continued authorizing advances. He approved operational plans that emphasized momentum, and he allowed American commanders to act decisively within his broad strategic framework. In effect, Eisenhower shifted the balance of power without announcing it. Command authority remained formally collective, but in practice it flowed through him. Decisions were made closer to the front. Tempo replaced debate. The war moved too fast for prolonged political intervention. Churchill sensed the shift. His influence was no longer determining events, it was reacting to them. Messages arrived after decisions had already been executed. Caution arrived after breakthroughs had been exploited. By late 1944, the disagreement had evolved into something deeper than strategy. It was about who truly controlled the war. Churchill still expected deference born of experience and seniority. Eisenhower believed the command came from responsibility and results. And without a single dramatic confrontation, Eisenhower made his position clear. The war would be fought forward, not from London. By the end of 1944, the outcome of the struggle was no longer in doubt. Allied armies were advancing toward Germany on a scale and at a speed no coalition force had ever sustained before. The front stretched hundreds of miles, supplied by a logistical system operating at the edge of its capacity. But it was holding. More importantly, the Germans were no longer dictating the rhythm of the war. Eisenhower was. Churchill continued to raise concerns. He worried about overstretched supply lines, the vulnerability of exposed flanks, and the political consequences of an American-dominated advance into the heart of Europe. But his interventions had changed in tone. They were no longer attempts to redirect the campaign. They were cautions, not commands. Eisenhower acknowledged them, then moved forward anyway. There was no dramatic refusal, no sharp rebuke, no moment where Eisenhower openly challenged Britain's prime minister. That was never his method. Instead, he exercised authority through consistency. Orders flowed, advances continued. The campaign's momentum became irreversible. When the Germans launched their last major counteroffensive in the Ardennes, Eisenhower did not yield operational control. He coordinated responses, shifted forces, and absorbed the shock without altering the fundamental strategy. Speed slowed where necessary, but it was Eisenhower who decided when and how. Churchill watched closely. The counteroffensive validated some of his fears, but it also confirmed Eisenhower's command. The response was decisive. The Germans were contained, then crushed, and once the danger passed, the advance resumed. By early 1945, the reality was unmistakable. The Allied war effort had a single center of gravity, not London, not Washington, but Eisenhower's headquarters. Churchill understood this. He did not protest publicly. He did not attempt to reclaim authority. Britain remained a crucial partner, experienced, resilient, and indispensable. But it no longer set the pace. What Eisenhower said in this moment mattered less than what he did. He listened, he weighed advice, and then he acted according to his own judgment. This was not a victory of ego over experience. It was the quiet consolidation of command in a coalition war where hesitation could be fatal. Eisenhower did not demand obedience. He earned it by keeping the alliance moving forward when stopping would have been easier. When the war in Europe ended, the partnership held. But it had changed. The battlefield had chosen its leader. And everyone, including Winston Churchill, knew it.